I'm Ashley Kane. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Pediatric Disaster Medicine Special Interest Group here at Wadham, and I'm joined by Dr. Ryan Hatta, who chairs the Counterterrorism Medicine Special Interest Group. We are delighted to introduce Stacey Pizzino. Stacey is a global health expert with a passion for improving the lives of those impacted by armed conflict, disasters, and humanitarian emergencies. Her dissertation is the world's largest study of landmine and explosive ordnance casualties, examining over 100,000 persons across 17 countries. Her work draws on her background as a paramedic and focuses on strengthening the evidence base to improve outcomes for vulnerable communities affected by crises and disasters. Stacey also contributes to research on the environmental health impacts of conflict and disaster risk reduction, co-editing an upcoming textbook on disaster health management. She has presented her findings at the United Nations and other key international meetings, and on behalf of Wadham Counterterrorism Medicine and Wadham Pediatrics, we are delighted to welcome her today. Stacey, please.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, everybody, for joining in today and for the opportunity to share my research. So I'll get started, and I'll give you a little overview. So just to tell you what I'll discuss today. So firstly, I will briefly discuss the background and context for this research, outlining some of the relevant knowledge gaps. I'll outline the aim of the research and the methods used, with a brief chat around the framework that underpinned the data collection process. I'll then discuss some of the key findings. Before I begin, though, I'd like to tell you a story. So this story is inspired from some of the data, however, with some of the details changed to protect identities. In the mountains of Laos, there lived two brothers. They grew up together in a small village, surrounded by lush greenery and towering mountains. The elder brother was responsible and caring, while the younger one was adventurous and always looking for new challenges. One day, the elder brother returned home to find his mother unwell, and she'd been sick like this before, and he remembered how his grandmother had found a root in the forest that had helped her feel better. So he decided to go and find it again, and he asked his younger brother to accompany him. Together, they set off down the same track that their grandmother had taken. The forest was lush and green, and the leaves rustled in the breeze. As they walked, the brothers talked and laughed, enjoying each other's company and the beauty of their surroundings. Eventually, they reached the spot near where their grandmother had found the root. And the younger brother eagerly started to dig around, searching for this precious root that would help heal their mother. Suddenly, there was a loud explosion and everything went black. When the older brother woke up, he was lying on the ground, surrounded by debris. He looked down and saw that his leg and arm were badly injured. Pain permeated in his entire body. As he tried to piece together what had occurred, he saw his younger brother lying still beside him. The explosion had killed him instantly. Tears streamed down the elder brother's face as he lay alone in the forest, in pain, struggling to comprehend what had happened. This story and many like it are common around the world. Landmines and explosive ordnance contaminate the landscape of over 60 countries. They are the enduring legacy of war, and they impact for generations following the cessation of conflict. Humanitarian mine action is the response to this problem, yet we haven't fully understood the extent of the issue or what those health impacts are until now. First off, though, I want to turn our attention to injuries. Globally, injuries of all causes are well recognised as a major public health concern. Yearly, more than 5 million people die as a result of injuries, with injury-related mortality accounting for 8.43% of global deaths. So that's almost 1.6 times the number of fatalities that collectively result from HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. Estimates reveal that 90% of global injury-related mortality occurs in low and middle-income countries. And then for populations that are living in conflict-affected communities, they also contend with ongoing injury risk exposure from post-war contamination. So this contamination and that is landmines, improvised explosive devices, and other explosive remnants of war. They are the enduring legacy of war, and they can manifest in disabling injuries for generations following the end of wars. So on this slide, we can see an anti-personnel landmine, an example of an IED, which have featured repeatedly within children's toys in recent conflicts, as well as a cluster munition, which is a common type of explosive remnant of war. And it comes from a large aerial drop bomb that opens with these smaller munitions, scattering them across the landscape. However, not all explode on impact, and they're highly volatile. So these are quite common in Laos, where it's estimated about 260 million of these bombs were dropped from 1964 to 1973. So that's the equivalent of every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day, for 9 years straight. And use of these types of bombs has also been documented in the last year in Ukraine, Myanmar, and Syria. The use of landmines and explosive weapons contamination, it's not a new phenomenon. Landmines have played a key role in military strategy, at least since the First World War, and unexploded ordnance from that era remains in the environment, posing problems today. And while the use of these explosive weapons is not new, the past century has seen a change in the nature of warfare. So it's changed from that traditional state-centric conflict with clearer delineations between military and non-combatants into wars involving intrastate and non-state armed groups with increasingly blurred distinctions between combatants and civilians. And then there's convergence between these warfare. So for example, in Ukraine, with state military forces, as well as partisans, separatists, and paramilitary. We also see wars fought in more urban areas today, which increases injury risk for civilians, as well as the direct targeting on civilian and civilian infrastructure, particularly places where civilians gather. Recent years has also seen an upsurge in armed conflict. So with 2 billion people, so this is a quarter of the world's population, living in countries experiencing war. There's also an increasing trend in the use of landmines and IEDs in conflicts with non-state armed actors in recent Daesh in Syria and Iraq, Boko Haram in Nigeria, directly targeting civilians. And then landmines, including those featuring artificial intelligence, have featured heavily in Ukraine, with Russia using landmines as victim-activated booby traps in positions of retreat. Landmines have also intentionally been contaminating farmland in Ukraine to specifically target agriculture. So we see their kind of weaponization of the food supply. We know that landmines and other ERW contaminate 61 countries, but the global estimates regarding the full health impacts of this contamination were unknown. Country or sub-regional epidemiological research is limited. What we do know comes from aggregated summary data from countries, or it comes via English language media monitoring. But that means that casualties that weren't reported by journalists or reported in languages other than English are not represented. From these summary and media data, the estimates are at least 148,000 people have been killed or injured by landmines or ERW since 1999. Approximately 56,000 have been killed or injured by cluster munitions, and over 170,000 have been killed or injured by IEDs since 2010. So current efforts to address the impact of this contamination have been shouldered by mine action organisations. And these organisations range from national mine action authorities to NGOs, with the United Nations Mine Action Service the overarching body. Ongoing contamination has resulted in global advocacy efforts and legislative response in the form of conventions such as the Mine Ban Treaty and the Cluster Munitions Convention. Late last year, we also had the Declaration on Protecting Civilians from Explosive Weapons in Populated Areas, so a WEPA, which strengthens civilian protection in conflict, as well as the PARAC Principles, which focuses on protecting the environment in conflict, but includes some provisions for the removal of explosive hazards. And these conventions not only prohibit the use of these weapons, but they also obligate signatories to provide assistance to affected communities. And the conventions oblige states parties to collect data on casualties to effectively address their needs. Yet despite these obligations, global casualty data analysis is absent and collected data isn't fully operationalised. In terms of the knowledge gaps which motivated this research, there's a few key points that I want to bring your attention to. So landmines and these explosive remnants are an enduring, destructive legacy of conflict and a public health issue which impacts civilians globally, yet there is a paucity of research. To date, analysis of available data is restricted to regional or country-level reporting of descriptive statistics and frequencies. There's no analysis that's examining global data from an epidemiological approach until now. And these knowledge gaps, they're important to address as this information can inform global response, including program planning, resource allocation and priority setting, as well as meet those international obligations. And then from a trauma care perspective, this information improves preparedness and optimal resource allocation. So for example, subspecialty expertise. Most importantly, however, these weapons are impacting some of the world's most vulnerable communities. And I feel that we have a moral obligation to address these impacts. So with this in mind, I wanted to begin building the foundational evidence base. But I was acutely aware that we're operating in a low resource setting, and I didn't want to utilize any of the available resources. The focus needs to be on clearance, on addressing the needs of survivors and preventing further incidents. But I did know that there was some data at least collected operationally, and so it was these data that I looked to. Humanitarian organizations, they often collect data as part of their operations, but they're more limited in their capacity for analysis and dissemination. And then the difficulty of conducting research in conflict zones is well established, which is why the comprehensive analysis of data that are collected is essential to provide more accurate global estimates. So the take-home message that I really want to emphasize here is that the available data could be more effectively used. So the commentary today should demonstrate that there is a terrible impact from these explosive weapons. And for the foreseeable future, in the absence of comprehensive mine clearance strategies and the cessation of use of these weapons, we must acknowledge it is a significant public health issue. So my research addresses the gaps that I've highlighted today. And the aim of this research was to establish the direct health impacts of explosive ordnance in low and middle income conflict-affected countries. So as I've alluded to earlier, populations impacted by protracted conflicts and contamination, they contend with not only this ongoing injury risk, but also state and health system fragility, displacement, poverty, and the consequences of which impact entire communities for whom an absence of health data means they remain invisible within global health information and their needs unaccounted for. Yet we have this operational data that could be utilised to provide a better insight into populations. So we have the why, but the how to access the data was a little less clear. And so the hardly reached data framework was the key to accessing the data needed to undertake a multi-country casualty analysis. So this HARD framework, which was developed as part of this PhD, it highlights the process of identifying and engaging with key stakeholders to access data that are hidden but available. And the 5 components provided an iterative process for identifying and engaging with stakeholders. And I don't have time to talk in detail about the framework, but essentially this was a tool that was used to map potential data custodians, engage with stakeholders, and then manage progress towards data access, analysis, and knowledge translation. And applying this framework to humanitarian mine action facilitated the data collection required for my research. And using this approach, I was able to complete the world's largest epidemiological study. So as shown on this map, I collected data on 105,913 casualties across 17 countries and autonomous regions. So the locations included Abkhazia, Afghanistan, Angola, Armenia, Cambodia, Chechnya, Colombia, Georgia, Kosovo, Laos, Lebanon, Libya, Nagorno-Karabakh, Somaliland, Sudan, Ukraine, and Yemen. And this was a retrospective analysis of secondary data. And so all the casualty data used in the study was multi-source, and the sample included people of all ages and genders who'd been killed or injured in an explosive ordnance incident. Now, there were a number of strengths related to this research, but firstly, I want to talk about the limitations before I talk about the findings. So, number one, there was non-uniform data reporting. So this meant some inconsistencies in how the data were captured. So, for example, in some places, age was captured as either over or under 18 years, while in other places, more specific ages were recorded. But that meant that a more fine-grained look at age was only possible in that smaller subset of the data. Also, in some locations, injury details were included, while in others, these just weren't captured. The design of this study was pragmatic, so not research question focused. And that meant key variables needed for a comprehensive study weren't available. So injury severity measures, disability measures, post-mortem injury details, information about mental health. And so that limited the interpretation. There were potential bias that could impact the findings of this study. So, for example, access bias, meaning only populations with relationships with those data custodians were captured. There's also the potential for recall bias in any retrospective data, as well as survivorship bias, particularly for the injury findings, because injury details were captured primarily for survivors. There was also some ambiguity related to the variables captured, and this related to that non-uniform data reporting. So, for instance, improvised explosive devices were included in these data, but it's not clear if these were victim activated. So in terms of the results, what I'll do is I'm going to talk about the mortality findings, and then I'm going to follow up and discuss the injury, so non-fatal injury findings. So the case fatality rate was 38.8 for the pooled data set. So for every 100 people injured by explosive ordnance, almost 39 died. Case fatality varied across the conflict-affected countries. So Laos PDR had the highest case fatality rate, while Armenia had the lowest. The Laos data, though, represented some of the oldest cases. They went back a few decades, and so it probably relates to the state of health services at the time, as well as the phase of active conflict. As shown on this slide, case fatality rates by year show an increasing trend. And increasing deaths due to explosive ordnance is also consistent with the landmine monitor. Males represented roughly 89% of casualties. And as a comparison, figures on the Landmine Monitor website for 2020 had males at 85%. Females represented 11% of casualties, yet the analyses showed that compared to males, females were 19% more likely to die when involved in an EO accident. So this raises a few important points. From a gender perspective, why are females at a higher risk of death, and how do we increase survival rates? And it also strengthens the evidence base to address these issues with robust proof that females experience a higher risk of death, which can be used for advocating for access to services and for respect for rights. It's also established in some previous research that women experience an increased mortality risk when in close proximity to active conflict. And so these findings suggest that this extends post-conflict for contaminated communities. And this increased mortality risk, it needs to be considered in post-conflict recovery. So building back better post-conflict requires health systems that sufficiently identify sex-specific health needs and provide equitable health systems. I also looked at age. So as I mentioned before, there were some issues around how age was captured. So I looked with two approaches. Firstly, adult versus child. So this represented about 92,000 casualties overall, with adults representing 71% and children aged under 18 comprising 29%. Running analyses showed that overall, children had a 26% lower risk of death. So I was really surprised by this. I'd expected children to have an increased risk. However, there is some discussion in more recent research around slighter differences between adult and child mortality rates. And these findings potentially strengthen that discussion, but I think more research is needed. Importantly, though, what these findings do mean is that in these data, children are surviving more than adults comparatively. The increased survivorship for such a young group raises the importance of considering disability across the lifespan. So, for instance, appropriate rehabilitation and support that's ongoing and sustainable, with training of local staff to ensure lifelong needs are met. It's also important to note that these mortality figures only reflect the direct health impacts of explosive ordnance. So they're not taking into consideration indirect or reverberating effects. So current research suggests that children are disproportionately affected by indirect health effects related to conflict, such as communicable, neonatal, nutritional diseases. And so children facing the threat of explosive ordnance can encounter challenges in accessing clean water and sanitation, education, immunisation services, which would further impact their health outcomes. So child mortality certainly needs further investigation, particularly with those reverberating effects considered. So because I did have that question around age and the findings were less expected, I also looked at the outcomes in the subset. So this was a smaller but still sizable sample of 48,772 casualties. And these were the casualties for whom the actual age at the time of accident was known. So as you can see here, the age group between 18 to 24 years, that accounted for the largest group of these casualties. And so when I looked at risk again with this subgroup, there was a trend of increasing risk of death correlated to increasing age. And I used the age group of 30 to 34 years as the reference group. So you can see here that younger than 30 to 34 years had a lower risk of death, while for older age groups, this risk increased. This has implications for older age groups. Older populations affected by crisis and by armed conflict can be overlooked, despite a susceptibility to ill health, malnutrition, disability, comorbidities, and marginalisation. So it's important to also consider these higher risk older age groups. Most casualties within these data were civilians, so roughly 85%. High numbers of civilians, it's consistent with previous research, and civilians had increased mortality compared to non-civilians. So a 72% increased risk of death. The disproportionate impact of explosive ordnance on civilians has been frequently highlighted, and these findings are consistent with those reports. It's important as it highlights not only are civilians most affected, but they're also at highest risk of dying. And then across all the explosive types, males accounted for the most injured sex. These figures showed males at increased rates compared to what had been previously reported. And children were injured more by explosive remnants of war and improvised explosive devices. IEDs were the most deadly weapon, with 45% of casualties dying from their injuries. And that's important to note as IED use is increasing. When compared, so using anti-personnel landmines as the reference group, when compared to those, anti-tank mines, explosive remnants of war, and IEDs, they all showed increased risk of death. So compared to anti-personnel mines, anti-tank mines had a 13% increased risk of death. Explosive remnants of war had a 32% increased risk of death, and IEDs a 43% increased risk of death. And so these findings substantiate previous research regarding that increased severity of injuries from IEDs that has been reported in military studies. And it's demonstrating that military research also is corresponding in this case to civilian populations. And the expanded use of these devices has implications for humanitarian response in conflict settings. So I looked at the activity at time of incident, or the preceding circumstances. And for civilians, engaging in agricultural activities, being a bystander, or collecting food, water, or wood were the most common activities at the time of incident. Looking at risk, so the statistical models revealed a number of higher risk activities using foraging, so collecting food, water, or wood as a reference group. So compared to that, traveling had a 33% increased risk of death. active conflict and being a bystander both had 22% increased risk of death, and making fire a 17% increased risk of death. So these findings strengthen the evidence base by extending on those previous frequency reports, and they confirm travelling as a particularly risky activity in conflict-affected settings. And that's important, as migration is typically increased due to conflict-induced displacement, as people travel to either avoid the effects of violent conflict and then return home after the end of wars. So stratifying by age and looking at child casualties compared to adult casualties revealed some different activities as mortality predictors. So children had an 84% higher risk of death during active conflict compared to adults, 49% higher risk of death while playing, and a 43% higher risk of death as a bystander compared to adults. Previous research has established that child blast casualties are often mass casualty events with multiple children playing together. And this congregated playing behaviour may explain that increased risk we see here for child bystanders. And you can also see here children who engaged in demining. They had 110% higher risk of death. And while this finding was statistically significant, I think you can see the confidence intervals are really quite broad. So this finding isn't as precise as I would like to see. So I think more research would be needed to confirm that. And it's also unclear if informal demining, if it's related to informal demining, or the exact ages that it related to for those children. So moving on to talk about injury. This study examined a subset of the data. So injury details weren't collected in all locations. And the subset comprised of 44,818 casualties across 7 of the countries. So it was Abkhazia, Afghanistan, Colombia, Chechnya, Laos PDR, Somaliland, and Ukraine. And the overall distribution of trauma is shown here. So lower limbs were the most common anatomical injury location, followed by upper limbs. Over a third of survivors had injuries to more than one body region, with a mean of 1.5 body regions out of a possible 6. And they had increased rates of multiple injuries were found in child casualties. So another important thing to note here, you can see that there's lower numbers of thoracic, abdominal, and pelvic injuries. So this is likely a survivorship bias, as the sample captured primarily survivors, and so injury data wasn't recorded for those who died. In the current state of trauma care, injuries to those regions are typically non-survivable, particularly in these settings, so that would explain those lower percentages. Female survivors had a higher risk of injury to those regions, though, compared to males. So that's thoracic, abdominal, pelvic, as well as head and neck. And as I highlighted earlier, females have that higher risk of death compared to males. So this all needs further exploration. Ideally, examining post-mortem injury details, as this would help to develop an understanding of the primary cause of death and help tailor trauma care interventions to address avertible mortality. No difference was noted between males and females for risk of injury to lower limbs, and there was no difference between males and females for rates of multiple injuries. So this study found that children were more injured in the upper body and upper limbs when compared to adults, which supports some previous research. Children had an increased risk of injury to head, neck, thoracic, abdominal, and upper limb regions, while adults had a higher risk of pelvic and lower limb regions. Researchers suggested a protective effect of height, with the distribution of injuries associated with the proximity of the casualty to the ground. So that would explain the distribution seen in this study. But I also want to flag the high risk of head and neck injuries in children compared to adults. This has implications for pediatric neurocognitive rehabilitation, which yields significant implications for subsequent development. And children were also more impacted by multiple injuries with higher rates compared to adults. So this increased multiple trauma. It's important to note, as it means in this data set, children are surviving with injuries distributed across multiple body regions. And this has implications for healthy life expectancy and disability. Research highlights that casualties sustaining injuries across multiple regions have increased impairment and disability, with polytrauma impacting quality of life, physical and psychosocial outcomes. So accordingly, the health needs of survivors across the lifespan must be considered, particularly for children. The disproportionate impact of armed conflict on civilians, it highlighted that in terms of mortality. And similarly, civilians represented the group with the most injuries in these data. So it was 88% of the casualties. In this study, civilians appear to experience more severe, complex, widespread injuries than non-civilians. So for example, civilians were found to have increased risk of amputation, increased rates of multiple trauma when compared to non-civilians. They also experienced a higher risk or higher odds of thoracic, abdominal, and pelvic injuries. And overall, these results highlight the vulnerability of civilians during and after armed conflict, with explosive ordnance resulting in widespread injuries. And so it's important to highlight here as well, combatants are typically, they're engaging with these devices, usually with some form of personal protective equipment, whereas civilians are interacting with contamination without any form of protection. And so this has implications for the injury severity and for mortality. So breaking this down by explosive type, it shows for both anti-personnel and anti-tank landmines and for improvised explosive devices, lower limbs were the region most frequently affected. And for explosive remnants of war, both extremities were highly involved, with upper limbs featuring slightly more. And the regression models for this study, they revealed a number of important findings. So improvised explosive devices, they caused severe and complex injuries. There were increased rates of multiple trauma, increased risk of injury to head, neck, thoracic, abdominal, and upper limb, pelvis and upper limb injuries. And this is particularly important given that increasing prevalence of this type of weapon. And the increased risk of pelvic injury related to IEDs is also notable, as military researchers found that improvised devices, particularly improvised anti-personnel mines, caused more severe injuries with pelvic involvement in military settings. So this research has shown that it's also happening in civilians. Both anti-tank mines and improvised explosive devices have increased rates of multiple trauma compared to anti-personnel mines. And it provides further evidence of the destructive impact of these weapons. Explosive remnants of war had a higher risk of upper limb injuries, and so that substantiates in previous reports suggesting ERW injuries were elevated in that region. So there was a study set in Afghanistan that suggested that ERW were associated with activities that involved handling devices, so tampering, playing, that type of thing. And then lower limb injuries were associated with anti-personnel mine in these data. And that makes sense, as the design of these weapons targets the lower limbs. So that's the main findings that came from this PhD. And I feel like I've talked enough, so I'm going to stop and move on to questions. But thank you. And I might stop screen sharing for a minute.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Stacey, for that amazing presentation. Really, really well done. And your research is extremely thorough and very well thought out. So a lot of different pieces there that we could explore. I had a couple of questions I wanted to ask, and then I'd like to go to the audience. We have one question in the Q&A, and if anybody else would like to type a question in the Q&A, we could then get to those. One of the things that you had mentioned were the injury patterns, of course, and then the mortality and the case fatality rate. And those are fascinating. And I think most people understand that unexploded ordnance and landmines obviously cause a lot of psychological and physical trauma. But one of the things that I had read, and maybe you could speak to this, is that there are often long-term environmental and health effects to these weapons that we don't necessarily think about, and they're not something that's often studied. So maybe you could discuss some of the long-term health and environmental effects, specifically regarding developmental, generational, or ecological impacts.
Yeah. Funny, we actually have a publication out in the conversation in Australia today on kind of on this topic. So conflict pollution and like toxic remnants of war. So it's not only explosive ordnance, but also from other kind of toxic legacies related to conflict. It's a long-term issue. So the contamination that results from breakdown and targeting of infrastructure. So for example, Russian military strikes on Ukrainian refineries have resulted in toxic pollution. So this is an under-researched area, as you said. But what the studies have shown in terms of toxic remnants, there are some increased birth defects. So related, for instance, to Agent Orange in Vietnam, they found in some of the locations there are extremely high levels of dioxins in soil, in food, as well as human breast milk and blood. There was also in Croatia, higher metal blood concentrations were found in people who had been exposed to heavy fighting. And then in terms of landmines and explosive ordnance, so the research has also shown some of those more indirect or reverberating intergenerational impacts. So, for example, damage to infrastructure, contamination of arable land. It prevents reconstruction efforts and it hinders development. So it's resulting in these long-term intergenerational impacts. So, for example, the loss of agricultural land can result in food insecurity and loss of livelihood, while injuries and resulting disabilities, they pose a financial burden for survivors and families. And these costs can exacerbate existing poverty. So they can result in a downward kind of economic mobility for already marginalized communities. There's also some research from Angola that showed a relationship between suspected hazardous areas and lower weight for age and lower height for age scores. Human capital development is also hampered by EO contamination. So in Cambodia, there was some research that demonstrated educational losses in communities that had landmine contamination. And I've seen some research also from Mozambique that highlighted that relationship between poverty and landmine contamination as well. So it does have that, as you said, these long-term intergenerational impacts in terms of ecological, in terms of health. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's fascinating and it's really sad. And I think there are a lot of things that we don't necessarily think about and how these impact the environment and individuals and communities and countries and populations. So thank you for that. I think maybe we could go to the Q&A now with some of the members here. So can you see these, Stacey?
Let me click it open. I'm just having a little look. I'm just looking at Megan's first. Oh, well, that was Megan.
So I'll go ahead and read Megan's question because for the participants. So Megan says that while working in Ukraine, she was asked to educate on blast injury, but that for security reasons, the government would often protect data on injuries to their military personnel. As you so really well highlighted, the availability of data and the gating and selection of data really inhibits our ability to make conclusions. And so how would you encourage countries to share that kind of sensitive information, and what would be their benefit to sharing if they don't have the infrastructure or resources to provide care and rehabilitation?
So within, if I'm explaining something people already know, stop me. But so within mine action, there's these things called international mine action standards. It's been developed out of UNMAS and Geneva International Centre for Humanitarian Demining. And they provide national mine action authorities and national mine action centres with standards and the ways to collect data on casualties. And so from my perspective, I've seen the minimum data standards that have been included in those standards. And I think if countries could be encouraged and supported to start capturing that data in a more comprehensive way and then supported in terms of operationalizing it. But I do understand in terms of the security issues and things like that. But then that you do have countries, so for example, Colombia, they had their data on their civilian casualties de-identified and made open access. So there is precedence for this. And I'm just
Absolutely.
saying, need
Yeah.
to look at
So
the question again.
there's
Right,
another one
answer.
here, Rowena Christensen. Says, thank you very much, Stacey. Great work. Seeing stories about Ukraine in particular, I always wonder, are there any remote technologies that can be used to trigger and explode landmines and effectively clear the land before any human ventures in? Clearing all the land used ordnance, clearing all the used ordnance from the land seems to be an impossible task when there is so much of it. So that kind of was one of the questions that we had as well in terms of any exciting or new technologies that assist in clearing these types of devices.
Yes. So in terms, I'm not an EOD expert at all, so I will answer from what I know. When I was I was at the UN NDM meetings earlier this year, and when I was at that, I learned about this really great project. So this is in terms of detecting land that's like contaminated land. So it was a project between Humanity and Inclusion and a group called Mobility Robotics. And so basically what they were doing was using low cost, off the shelf drones, and they were using them to map and analyze contaminated land to locate unexploded ordnance, landmines, etc. And it was something like over the 5 years that they'd been doing this project, they'd mapped 25 million square meters of hazardous areas using these high resolution maps to look for signs of contamination. So I think they were looking for like craters, traces of incidents involving animals, vehicles. And I think using those kind of forms of low cost, more accessible innovation to speed up land release, I think that's really exciting. In terms of actually the person going down, I don't know of innovation in that area. But like I said, EOG is just, I'm not an expert in that space.
Sure. And then Zakaria Mani asked, and goes directly to the research and your methodology, what are the challenges that you faced for data collection? And are there databases for landmine data, including types of injuries?
So no, there were, other than the data that was open access from Colombia, no, there wasn't a database as such. A lot of countries are using a type of information system now to collect information. So I can see in the future there's the potential for that. But in terms of the data I collected, so the way I did it was I used that framework and I mapped out all the countries that had contamination. I worked out who the stakeholders were in those countries, and then I contacted them. And the challenges in terms of resource issues, in terms of IT, had to, sometimes emails would bounce back just because the server capacity wasn't there. So it was managing and retrying to keep persisting to get the data. And then tracking that progress on such a big scale, that in itself was a challenge. And then the data sharing agreements, and to make sure that it was an ethically done study. So that there were numerous challenges.
Wonderful. Yeah, that was one of the things when we met at Wadham. I was very impressed by the amount of effort and the persistence. Really, really incredible. So did you have any questions beyond that, Ashley or Leah?
I'm just seeing
Yes.
Megan.
Oh, Megan.
Stacey, again, thank you so much. We wanted to ask a little bit about what practitioners, so medical practitioners or emergency managers who are looking at in that post-conflict zone or during active conflict, are looking at how they can respond in real time to these sorts of risks. What are there any tips you have or sort of things to consider for someone who's looking to either just inform their healthcare personnel or their infrastructure?
Yeah. So that's a big question. In terms of real time, not so much, but I'm going to talk about some stuff that's happening that I think has the potential to inform that in the future. So there is a really lovely doctor, a researcher from the University of Washington, called Dr. Hannah Wild. And I met Hannah when I was in Geneva for the UN, and then we crossed paths again in Cambodia recently. And she's leading together with UNMA, so United Nations Mine Action Service. They've kind of pulled together this trauma, what do they call it? Mine Action Trauma Care Collaborative. I think that's what it's called. Anyways, she's doing this incredible work around the CCCC, so Civilian Casualty Care Chain. And basically she's adapting a military approach to casualty care. So in terms of bringing care forward to the patient, more rapid transit to definitive care, and then translating trauma care advances to low resource settings. So she's looking there. It's a pilot, I believe, in the next year or so. But what I've seen so far in terms of what they're planning in terms of reducing avoidable mortality, I think has such potential. I'm really inspired by the work that this group are doing. So I hope that kind of answers the question. So not yet, but watch this space and keep an eye out for Hannah, because she's doing great things.
Fantastic.
Stacey,
Again,
thank you so much for your lecture and all the knowledge that you share with us. I think putting the spotlight on the pediatric population is so important in those situations, and I really appreciate your work. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. I don't see any more chat questions. I think we just had one more as far as you really well highlighted that need to focus not just during the conflict, but after the conflict on those indirect and after effects once injury has occurred, not only to direct survivors, but to their families and caregivers. And any other points that you'd like to make about how communities or healthcare systems could maybe provide better supports for these indirect effects?
Yeah, so I think there is a growing, I noticed in the meetings I've been in, there's a growing kind of focus on psychological impacts, so psychosocial supports. I think that's really important. Adverse psychological outcomes related to conflict, that is well established. And the research, I know in terms of explosive ordnance, there's some similar trends in terms of PTSD, in terms of anxiety, depression. But I do feel that that's a very under-researched area. And also around that disability stuff. So I'm aware that in terms of those like mine action standards that I talked about, in terms of that minimum data standard, they've started integrating like the Washington group questions to start capturing what are those long-term effects. So it's not analysed yet as far as I've seen, but I think that's really important work going forward.
Wonderful. All right. Is there anything else? So we've heard about Dr. Wild. We've heard about the possible robot and drone use for clearing arable land. Is there anything else exciting that we should watch out for going forward?
Yeah, I've heard of in Australia, so CSIRO have a new program trying to work out how to use AI in terms of clearance. I haven't heard a lot of details, but watch that space as well.
Great. Well, again, Stacey Pizzino, thank you so much, and we look forward to your research in the future. I mean, just your thoroughness and the effort that you go to bring these crucial issues to life for people who are often in really overlooked areas of the world, and or even in conflict zones that we see in the news every day, but we really don't realize just the depth of penetration of ordnance into the human population. Just thank you for all the work you've done on this, and we look forward to your papers and to what you're going to do in the future.
Thanks for having me on. It was lovely meeting you guys in Ireland and to finally get the chance to have a chat about this. Thank you. I'm honored.